My strong appeal to both parties, to Hezbollah and to Israel, is for a ceasefire to stop the war.
With Lebanon under fire, the UN chief visits Beirut calling for peace. Israel's bombing campaign has displaced nearly 1 million people. Now its troops are advancing and threatening to stay. So what's the end game? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. It took just 2 days for Lebanon to be dragged into the US-Israeli war against Iran. A ceasefire had been in place in Lebanon since November 2024. But in truth, the cross-border violence between Hezbollah and the Israeli military didn't really end. Now, nearly 1 million people have been forced from their homes. The UN Secretary-General, on a surprise visit to Beirut, says Lebanon is part of a war it did not choose. But Israel is ramping up its offensive. The Israeli Defense Minister says if the Lebanese government won't rein in Hezbollah, Israel will. So what happens if it does, and what does that mean for civilians? We'll put those questions to our panel of guests in a moment, but first this report from Fintan Monaghan.
Late afternoon in Beirut. The silence is shattered by an explosion. Then another. Israeli raids hit areas in Lebanon's capital, while also targeting Bekaa Valley in the east and border regions in the south. The strikes follow Hezbollah's attacks on Israel after the assassination of the Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, a development that has pulled Lebanon into the wider conflict involving Iran, Israel and the US. Defense Minister Israel Katz says Israel will act on its own if the government doesn't stop Hezbollah.
I
warned the Lebanese president that if the Lebanese government is unable to control its territory and prevent Hezbollah from threatening our towns in the north and firing toward Israel, then we will take control of the territory ourselves.
Hezbollah's actions have sparked outrage in Lebanon. Since the hostilities resumed on March the 2nd, nearly 700 people, including children, have been killed and nearly 1 million have fled their homes. Earlier this week, Israel issued forced evacuation orders in towns and villages along the border and around the Litani River, threatening to attack. A new order issued on Thursday expanded the zone to include communities south of the Zahrani River. The total area covers more than 10% of Lebanon's territory. The move is prompting fears that Israel's military campaign could outlast the current war with Iran. On Friday, the UN Secretary-General made a surprise visit to Beirut, perhaps an indication of just how far-reaching these concerns are.
My strong appeal to both parties, to Hezbollah and to Israel, is for a ceasefire to stop the war and pave the way to find a solution that would allow Lebanon to become a country independent, with sovereignty and territorial integrity respected.
As the conflict escalates and the UN mission appears to have failed, for communities caught up in the violence, peace remains elusive. Fintan Monaghan, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Before we speak to our panel, joining us from Naqoura in the south of Lebanon is Candice Ardiel, the spokesperson for UNIFIL, the United Nations interim force in Lebanon, the UN peacekeepers who are there on the ground. Candice, let me ask you about the current situation. First, how would you describe the military situation where you are?
Thanks, James. The situation here in South Lebanon at the moment, as you can understand, is extremely tense. It's extremely volatile. Since the 2nd of March, when Hezbollah claimed responsibility for an attack on Israel, we've seen daily missile, rocket, and drone attacks coming from Lebanese territory. And of course, we've seen daily responses in terms of airstrikes, artillery, and other attacks coming from Israel to Lebanese territory. Obviously, this puts us as peacekeepers in a very challenging position. We've seen the displacement of Lebanese authorities tell us up to 500,000 people from UNIFIL's area of operations, some within the area, some going northward. So we've seen a great deal of displacement, destruction, and violence here in South Lebanon. Peacekeepers are here on the ground, continuing to do the work that we can at the moment, but obviously this is very challenged.
So tell me more about the humanitarian fallout. Clearly, Israel has been demanding that people leave. We're seeing scores of people leaving, many thousands of people leaving, but I guess there are some staying behind as well. What are the conditions?
Within our area of operations, we're seeing a great deal of back and forth exchanges of fire across the blue line on a daily basis. As I mentioned, there are airstrikes, artillery, rockets coming from Lebanese territory, missiles. So there's a great deal of destruction. Many people have left. And peacekeepers have actually helped facilitate the safe movement of about 100 civilians who requested our help to leave to move to safer areas. Many people have left on their own, but there are still people who stay, and they're living in very difficult conditions. But these are their homes. People, you can understand, they don't want to leave. But the situation is extremely volatile. It's extremely dangerous. And the violence is continuing. And as peacekeepers, we're here trying to do what we can, but in this situation, it becomes very difficult.
Of course, as you say, you are a peacekeeping force. I don't know the current numbers because I'd struggle to get them on your website, but somewhere around 10,000 troops, maybe a little less than that you currently have in the country. What are they actually doing? Are they keeping the peace? Because UNIFIL's been there for 47 years and your big bosses, the UN Security Council, they've already said they're planning to disband your force.
In fact, we now have about 7,500 peacekeepers due to recent reductions in our force because of the liquidity crisis that the entire UN is facing. And this is separate indeed from the withdrawal that UNIFIL has been asked to do when our mandate comes to an end at the end of this year. The Security Council has said that our mission will end December 31st, 2026, and peacekeepers will begin to leave throughout 2027. Now, this is obviously a very challenging situation now because we have fewer peacekeepers to be able to do the work that we did. We've had to adjust the way that we operate. But nonetheless, we continue to do that work and we'll continue to do that throughout 2026.
You say you continue to do the work. Right now, though, with missiles flying, with some Israeli troops on the ground in southern Lebanon, are your troops actually doing anything, or are they just hunkering down in their bases?
Well, definitely the work has changed. We've had to adapt what we do. Previously, we could be out patrolling throughout the area of operations and doing things like that. But now peacekeepers are, for the most part, confined to bases. There are still some movements for essential logistical resupplies of fuel, food, and water. But for the most part, peacekeepers are in their bases. We have about 50 bases throughout South Lebanon, many of them, more than half of them, along the blue line. So this does give us some visibility into what's happening on the ground. But of course, it's not the same as it was before. And nonetheless, peacekeepers remain in position to continue to monitor and report, to provide at least some information to the Security Council about what's happening on the ground.
Candice Ardiel, the spokesperson for UNIFIL, the UN force in southern Lebanon, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, let's discuss all of the issues that have been raised with our panel of guests who are joining us on Inside Story today. From Paris, Nadim Houry, Executive Director of the Arab Reform Initiative. Maureen Philippon is in Beirut. She's the Norwegian Refugee Council's Country Director for Lebanon. And in Athens, Nicholas No, Editor-in-Chief of the Beirut-based news service MideastWire.com. Thank you very much for joining us. Maureen, let me start with you. We're just hearing from UNIFIL in the south. They say on this day when the UN Secretary General is visiting Beirut that their peacekeepers are trying to help people. But let's get the picture across the country and where you are in Beirut, where many people have fled to. How bad is it?
It's fairly bad. I mean, across the country. Certainly the south is, and with Beirut suburbs, is the most affected by the bombardment, but the displacement, the scale and the speed of the displacement has affected the entire country. The anxiety, the stress, the people, fleeing with nothing, sometime in the middle of the night, it's really something quite dramatic to see. They are many of them have found shelter in schools that are really not proper for settling in with your family. They are turning classroom into bedrooms, sharing the classroom with 3-4 families that they don't know from before. So the situation is fairly rough.
Nicholas, these people are fleeing from bombardment by Israel, but also, and we've seen this before in Gaza, they're fleeing because of the threat of bombardment. The Israeli military issuing orders of forced expulsion to people, terrifying people, saying you've just got to leave now.
I mean, not only terrifying immediately, but it looks like in the last few hours, and we've seen some reporting, that the Israeli military is now going after civilian infrastructure directly as a matter of principled policy. This is going to have an even worse effect on an already very dire situation, and attacks, some of which are clearly illegal under international law inside Lebanon. Let's leave aside the rest of the region for a moment. So it looks as if the impact on civilians is going to dramatically worsen in the coming hours and days, especially if Israel ramps up what appears to be the beginning of concerted attacks on civilian infrastructure. And I'd say a second thing, which is even worse, is that the policy by the Israelis, it seems, has been to try to exacerbate underlying sectarian religious divisions, geographic divisions as well, by trying to funnel people of certain communities through certain areas, by targeted bombings, which can enhance some of the underlying sectarian or religious differences that have long existed in Lebanon. That awful strategy appears to be one that the Israelis are intent on also driving forward in an attempt possibly to try to have Lebanese turn on one another and thus embroil Hezbollah in a fight in its own depth, a fight against other Lebanese citizens. And if that goes forward, remember, this is a country that was in civil war for over 15 years and has been living with that legacy for quite some time. This is something that could be absolutely disastrous for the humanitarian situation and for the hope to keep Lebanon together as a relatively stable, unified state.
Nadim, I mean, Israel says it responded because Hezbollah fired missiles because of what's going on in Iran, but there's growing evidence, is there not, that Israel has been planning this?
Sure. Look, I mean, this is, I would say, probably, just a continuation of what we've seen since 2024, right? There were about 10,000 violations by Israel of the ceasefire that was signed between Lebanon and Israel in September 2024. And this latest round is perhaps just a continuation of that. But we're also seeing Israel expanding, as Nick was describing, its targeting strategy compared to the last war in 2024. Basically using orders to displace large parts of the population, not even certain areas, to expanding what it considers, how it's using its targeting, including now targeting certain civilian infrastructure. It's clear that all the messaging from Israel is that they see this as their moment to end, in a way, to in their perspective, to defeat Hezbollah once and for all. The problem is, from recent history, not just in Lebanon, but across sort of armed insurgencies, we know you cannot end armed insurgencies purely by military power or airstrikes. So the only path forward is actually the path that was that the Lebanese state and government were implementing, which is a gradual disarmament of Hezbollah and a rebuilding of Lebanese state institutions. But unfortunately, Israel and the US are not providing the space and the time for this to take place. And I fear that we're really entering into this sort of war that there can be no winner, only loss and destruction in Lebanon.
Maureen, I mean, I'm going to bring up the example of Gaza again, because it seems to me civilians in Lebanon have no idea right now where is safe. And that means for civilians, nowhere is safe.
That's very true. It takes different shapes. When you are living in an area that just received an evacuation order, you don't know if and when Israel is going to strike. And so if you're just panicking and you want to leave that area, we've seen recently buildings that were warned before being targeted. And so the area around 300 to 500 meters having to be evacuated. That included the schools that host currently IDPs and also a kindergarten. And so everybody moved. And then for a few hours, they were just waiting and moved in a rush, moved in panic. And then for hours, they've been waiting for actually the bomb to fail. And then going back there, we have, even yesterday night, the strikes in Beirut. I had colleagues who actually did the same. They got the warning, they just fled for their homes. They didn't know whether there would be the strike, when would be the strike, what do they take with them, what do they have the time to prepare and take with them. So this is really creating a lot of fear and anxiety among the Lebanese population. Another example, we got our office in Tyre damaged by a strike nearby. So even though you're not a target and you think you're safe, but then the power of the strikes, the blast of the strikes, can also create significant damage. We are seeing significant level of destructions across Lebanon, and therefore people are making impossible choices. Either they flee somewhere where they hope for safety in living conditions that will be harsh. People sleeping in their cars, some people sleeping out on the Corniche in Beirut, or in schools where the conditions are, just better because you have a roof. The luckiest one can go to relatives or friends in safe area, or they decide to stay put and live through this moment of super strong fear and anxiety of maybe they're going to get bombed. There's still many people who could not make the move and look for safety because a variety of personal circumstances. If you take care of your old parents, for instance, it's super difficult to move somewhere else. So there is a lot of overlayering conditions that make actually searching for safety very difficult. Having said that, even if Israel issues notice for evacuation, civilians remain civilians wherever they are and at all times. So even if people don't move from the evacuation order under evacuation notice, they do remain civilians and they do remain protected by international humanitarian law.
Nicholas, as ever, in their public pronouncements, Israel try to make this sound simple. The Israeli Defense Minister, Israel Katz, saying he's told the Lebanese president that if it doesn't prevent Hezbollah threatening the north and firing at Israel, we'll take the territory and do it ourselves. There's an impossible dilemma for the Lebanese government now, isn't there?
The Lebanese government has long been in an impossible dilemma. We now know from clear public statements from American officials as well as Israeli officials, that for, let's say, 21 years after the Cedar Revolution, 2005, when Syrian troops were kicked out of the country, in part because of a large part of the Lebanese population rising up and demanding they exit following the assassination of a former prime minister. Unfortunately, since that time, the United States and Israel have refused to build the Lebanese army up to be a credible national defense force. Because as Tom Barak, the US envoy, said recently, that would mean being able to defend against Israel, and that is not going to happen. So you have an army that has been kept intentionally weak by the Israelis and the Americans, that they now want to do a job which they themselves have not been able to do until now. And let's remember as well that if the Israeli defense minister and other officials are saying the threat from Hezbollah is so awful and imminent and ongoing, then why haven't they launched this famed ground invasion yet? And I think part of the reason for that is that the Israeli ground forces are not ready and are not well equipped for yet another ground invasion and occupation of Lebanon, certainly not a
Okay.
large one.
Let me bring in Nadim on that particular aspect, because the threat is we will take the territory and do it ourselves. Perhaps you can add a little bit of a historical context here, because Israel invaded Lebanon in 1978, 1982, 2006 and 2024. It also occupied southern Lebanon for 18 years. Do you think they are seriously considering doing this again when it was such a failure every time they've tried this before?
Look, what I fear today is that they will create a new buffer zone in Lebanon. It will be a form of occupation similar to what we've seen in Gaza. But unlike what we saw in Israeli occupation up until 2000 in Lebanon, they will rely on new technology to have a light footprint on the ground, reducing the effectiveness of any resistance effort to push them out. And we're seeing it already, right? The entire front row of Lebanese villages have been entirely demolished, with a few exceptions. There are drones that are constantly monitoring what's happening. Farmers are forbidden from tending to the land. So in a way, it's a de facto occupation, even if they're not maintaining troops on the ground in a continuous manner. That is today, for me, the biggest threat to Lebanon, is a form of renewed occupation by Israel of a buffer zone, which could be, 6 kilometers in, 10 kilometers in. I don't know what they're thinking. And at that point, the impossible choices that will be offered to Lebanon would be sign a humiliating submission deal to Israel, or continue living what we've been living since 2024, a sort of occupation by space. I mean, the way Israel has been able to infiltrate, I just came back from Lebanon. People's phone rings and they get these recorded messages, move here, leave here, phone calls, a drone is over your head. It's really a new form of occupation. And Lebanon is very lonely today because the main theater of war is in the Gulf. So diplomatic energy support is all focused on what is happening in the Gulf, the impact on oil, the impact on world markets. Perhaps the only country that still has some diplomatic space for Lebanon is France, but we've seen that France has been unable to compel Israel to do anything, and France is even finding it hard to get the US to come up with a concrete way forward, because the US seems to be, so far, to be giving Israel a full green light to do whatever it wants to do.
Maureen, if I could bring you in again. So for much of the world, this is a sideshow. I know you don't have a crystal ball, but given everything you've heard, I assume as a humanitarian agency like yourself, you have to prepare for what might happen. Do you fear things are going to get worse?
I hope not, and I hope some form of going back to diplomacy will prevail and form of reason from all parties to the conflict. But indeed, we are preparing for worse. We are preparing for infrastructure like access being more difficult if bridges start being bombed and things like that. So we are really preparing to assist people wherever they have to stay. And in more and more challenging conditions and economic conditions, because then, it's not only the war, is then what are the impact of the war on the economic of a country and on the daily life of a country.
Nicholas, I mean, clearly the conflict in Lebanon broke out because of what happened in Iran, or at least the timing, the spark was that. But are these actually the same war? Or is the war in Lebanon a different war? And if Trump was to say, and the Iranians even say, the war ends with regard to the attack on Iran, do you fear that Israel might continue this conflict?
I think these two battlefields are deeply connected. And I think that it will be difficult to imagine that any one of the many actors involved will be able to disconnect different parts. I don't think at this point, given the existential nature of the open war, which Hezbollah and its main state ally, Iran, are engaged in, I don't see a kind of decoupling between the two, precisely for the reason that you raised, which is that kind of decoupling Lebanon from the Iran conflict at this point or in the coming period would expose Hezbollah to the full powers of Israel, which would help allow them to wreak greater destruction on the country, to do this kind of creeping technological occupation, which Nadim explained, which is new and which could conceivably get around some of the problems that the Israelis have in inadequate ground forces to actually occupy territory. So I do think that danger is so prominent for Hezbollah, and the fact that I believe that they and the Iranian leadership view this as really the kind of existential struggle, war, which they have believed is coming for decades and maybe ideologically and religiously believe in, that it will be enormously hard to decouple them, at least in this current trajectory.
Okay, Nadim, if I could bring you in at the end. The UN Secretary General has been in Beirut. Is there anything, in your view, you say the international community see this as a bit of a sideshow, is there anything they can do right now to stop this?
I mean, unfortunately, the UN is at its weakest point at this stage. The UN peacekeeping troops were themselves attacked, and the UN couldn't do much. It's very unfortunate. It's the state of the world we're in. But I have to say, I slightly disagree with Nick on one point, because one fear is that while Trump might be impatient in his war against Iran, and there might be a sort of agreement to a ceasefire on that massive front, Israel may decide to continue. And I'm not sure that Iran would continue the war just to support Hezbollah. So one concern amongst many Lebanese is that the conflict in Lebanon would continue because it doesn't affect world markets, it doesn't affect key countries in the GCC, and Israel would be given a free hand to continue what it's been doing. That is a real concern that many Lebanese are worried about, that the settlement would not resolve issues in Lebanon. I have to say, this is why it's very important to retain, even a semblance of limited agency by Lebanon at this stage, and to support efforts by the Lebanese official institutions to negotiate a ceasefire. Lebanon cannot remain hostage after 40 years of every single regional conflict, every single regional tension.
Nadim,
the country simply no longer has the capacity to absorb and deal with that.
Nadim Houry, Maureen Philippon and Nicholas No, thank you very much for joining us. Al Jazeera has comprehensive coverage of this story with our teams in Lebanon reporting around the clock. For more analysis and context, remember to check out our website, aljazeera.com. We'd love to hear your views and comments too. Go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or on X, you can find us at AJ Inside Story. Until next time, that's it from me, James Bays, and the team here. Stay safe and well. Bye-bye for now.